Hello students, welcome to your 2.3 instructional video, multiplying. There's the standard we're working on. And go ahead and get that journal page set up, and remember to include your standard, learning target, and date. Today's standard is I can solve problems that involve multiplying rational numbers. All right, let's start with multiplying integers with fractions. Let's remember that integers are our set of all of our whole numbers, including 0 and our negatives. So negative 6 is an integer. And all integers can be expressed as a fraction. They are the fraction of themselves over 1, because all numbers divided by 1 equal themselves. And fractions are division. So whenever you come up against multiplying an integer with a fraction, your first thing you should do is convert your integer to a fraction. So again, in negative 6 is the fraction negative 6 over 1. And the next thing we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and multiply those fractions. So I have negative 6 over 1 times 1/3. And we want to start with multiplying our numerators across. So in this case, my numerator is negative 6 times 1 is going to be negative 6. And then we're going to go ahead and multiply those denominators across. So in this case, 1 times 3 is just 3. And so now we're left with this fraction of negative 6/3, and it is time for us to simplify. So in order to simplify, we need to find out if they have any common factors. And the common factor of negative 6 and 3, one of them is 3. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to divide my top and bottom by 3. And I'm going to come up with the fraction negative 6 divided by 3 is negative 2. And 3 divided by 3 is 1, which is just the number negative 2. So negative 6 times 1/3 is negative 2. Now let's talk about working with negative fractions. When you see a negative in a fraction, it will be in one of 3 places. It could be hanging out up in the numerator, it could be down in the denominator, or it could be off out in front of the fraction itself. So let's see how to work with each of these 3 scenarios. So starting with negative in the numerator, again, the first thing you're always going to do is just multiply your numerators. So in this case, negative 2 times 3 is negative 6. And then we can move down and multiply those denominators. 3 times 5 is indeed 15. All right, and I'm going to do that for all of these. I'm going to do my numerator first. So 2 times 3, here we have 6. And in my denominator, now I have negative 3 times 5, which is negative 15. And then when you have your negative out in front of the fraction, you have a couple of options. My favorite thing to do is I always just pop that into the numerator. It helps me keep track of it. But if that's not what you want to do, you can also use your knowledge that a negative times a positive equals a negative, and then just treat it as if that fraction or that negative isn't even really there until the end. So I could just say, well, this is 6/15, and then since there was a negative out there, I know my answer has to be a negative. Now let's remember fractions are just division. So all of these, this one is negative 6 divided by 15. This one is 6 divided by negative 15. And this one is negative 6 divided by 15. I want you to go ahead and pause this and grab your calculators and find the decimal for each of these fractions. So what I found when I put those all into my calculator is that no matter where that negative was in the fraction to begin with, my outcome is the exact same value. The product is the same, negative 0.4. So it doesn't really matter where that negative is in a fraction as long as you use it consistently. So next up, we're going to check in on multiplying decimals by hand, because this is something that I was noticing a lot of students struggling with. And it gets even trickier when negatives are involved. So my first step, I just want to write this out like a subtraction problem, multiplication problem. So I'm going to say 15.04 times 0.03. Now the important thing to remember is you don't necessarily need to line up the decimal. What you want to worry about lining up is that last number in your product. So we want to line up those 3s and those 4s because those are the last numbers in our product. Okay. The reason you don't need to worry about lining up that decimal is because we're going to go ahead and kind of ignore the decimals. So I'm going to say, what I am going to do, before I completely ignore them, is I'm going to count how many places there are after each decimal. So in my first number, I have 1, 2 place values. And in my second number, I have 1, 2 place values. So I'm just going to write myself a note. There were 4 decimal places total. And then I'm going to erase this and rewrite it without the decimals. So I'm going to write this as negative 1504 times 003. And just refer to that note. And actually, I'm going to write another thing right here. I want to just multiply these as if they're both positive. So I'm just going to make myself a note also that a negative times a positive equals a negative. So I know that my answer is going to be a negative. And I'm going to go ahead and erase that negative as well. And then I just get to multiply like normal. So I would say 3 times 4 is 12. Carry that 1. Drop that 2. 3 times 0 is 0, but I have that 1, so I have to add it back in. 3 times 5 is 15, and I'll drop that 5 here and carry that 1. 3 times 1 is 3, add that 1 in, and 4. So now I have this number 4,512. And I'm going to go back to these notes I wrote myself. My decimal right now is right here. But up in my notes, I said 4 decimal places total, which means that I have to move my decimal 4 places total. So 1, 2, 3, 4. So right there. And also, I wrote myself a note that a negative times a positive is a negative. So I know that my answer has to be a negative. So what I actually come up with is negative 0.4512. Negative 0.4512. Lastly, let's talk about multiplying expressions when you have more than 2 factors. And in this, I also want us to look for some notes that I want you to take, is that if there are an odd number of negatives, what is going to be true of your product? And if there are an even number of negatives, what is going to be true of your product? So I'm going to start with negative 2 times 1/2. Only 2 factors here. This is negative 2 over 1 times 1/2. Which all equals negative 2 times 1 is negative 2, 2 times 1 is 2, so this comes out to just a negative 1. Now what happens in this next one right here when I add another product on the end? I added that negative 3 on there. So I already know the product of negative 2 times 1 because I just found it. I'm sorry, negative 2 times 1/2 because I just found it. It's negative 1. And then I can just carry down the other product and then multiply those two. So negative 1 times negative 3, a negative times negative is positive 3. Okay, so let's include another factor now. Well, I now know that negative 2 times 1 is negative 1. I dropped down that negative 3 already, and I know that that is positive 3. So now I can just drop down that last factor, times negative 4. 3 times negative 4 is going to be negative 12. All right, and then the last one, and let's see if we can start recognizing some patterns here. Again, I'm just going to go quite quicker on this. There's that negative 1. There's that positive 3. Here's that negative 12, and now I'm going to drop down my negative 5, which negative 12 times negative 5 is going to give me a positive 60. So let's take a look at odd versus even negatives and see what patterns we can find. So here in this first expression, I had 1 negative, and my answer was a negative. in my second expression, I have 1, 2 negatives, and my answer was a positive. In my third expression, I have 1, 2, 3 negatives, and my answer was a negative. And in my fourth expression, I have 1, 2, 3, 4 negatives, and my answer is a positive. And if you continued to add negative factors onto all of these, you would recognize this pattern where if there are an odd number of negatives in a multiplication expression, the product will always be negative. Right here we have 1 and it's a negative. 3, it's a negative. If there are an even number of negatives in multiplication expression, the product will always be positive. Here we have 2 and it's a positive. Here we have 4 and it's a positive. All right, let's go ahead and do this. You try it. Pause this and see what you can do with this. All right, I said that -1/2 times +4/5. I came up with -4/10, and I can go ahead and simplify that because -4 and 10 have a common factor of 2. So I'm going to divide each of those by 2. And I end up with 4 divided by 2 is 2, and 10 divided by 2 is 5, and that was all negative, so -2/5. All right, last one. Go ahead and try this. First, I want you to estimate if the product will be a positive or negative value and justify your estimation, and then go ahead and calculate that product. So when I was doing my estimation, I counted and I saw 1, 2 negatives. So I know if there's an even number of negatives, it's going to be a positive number. And then I just started my calculation. So 2 times -4 brought me down to -8. Drop down my 3. -8 times 3 was -24. Drop down that -1. -24 times -1 is a positive 24. All right, your next steps are to go grab those journal problems and give them a try. Good luck, y'all.